The Queen has asked me to form the next government, and I am indeed proud to accept. To govern is to serve.
Edward Heath was an unusual leader of the Conservative Party in that he was from a genuinely working-class background. Unlike those who'd come before him, Heath was the son of a chambermaid and a carpenter, earning his place at Oxford following a grammar school education. He was also the first leader of the Conservative Party to be elected, rather than appointed by an opaque process within the Conservative Party machine. He rose to prominence as Chief Whip, doing much to hold the Conservative Party together after Suez, and, under Harold Macmillan, he was tasked with negotiating Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, only for Britain's application to be vetoed by French President Charles de Gaulle. Heath became leader of the Conservative Party in 1965 and would retain the party leadership despite losing an election to Labour's Harold Wilson, who secured for the Labour Party a majority of 98 seats. He went on to fight a second election in 1970, defying everyone's expectations and winning an election that nobody predicted the Conservatives could win. After all, they were behind in the polls and would have to overturn a massive Labour majority to come to power. In the end, he did, of course, with a majority of 30.
And now he's coming to central office in his 3.5 litre, 3.5 litre rover, driven by his chauffeur Bob West, shaking hands now with Mr. Barber. And waving to the crowd, with the police holding them back, making sure that this time he didn't get...
The biggest achievement of Heath's period in office was his government's negotiation of Britain's entry into the European Economic Community. This would benefit Britain economically by tying the country to its nearest trading partners in Europe, but it would also mean surrendering some power to European institutions, which would lead to charges made by the left at the time that Britain's entry into Europe meant surrendering parliamentary sovereignty.
I believe that what sovereignty is about, is the power of the British people the right of the British people to govern themselves. And the fact that entry into the common market, already we're only half in at the moment, means the reduction in the power of the British Parliament to decide matters finally. And as we get deeper into the market, if we do, then that power of the British Parliament would be reduced all the more. So that's what I think it's about. It's the power of the British Parliament to govern the affairs of this country, a power of people to elect their own rulers, the people who impose their own taxes, to impose the major decisions of the country. That's what it's about. It's the power of the elected parliament.
Sovereignty is the power of a nation to look after what it regards as its best interests and the interests of its individual citizens. And I don't believe that sovereignty is something which you hoard like a miser and cover up in sacking and put in the cellar and go down with a candle and look at it from time to time to see it's still there. Sovereignty is something to be used. And I believe that we are justified in using it, in looking after British interests in the community and the interests of our citizens.
Heath's period in office was a particularly violent period in Northern Ireland, with relations between the British government and both Republican and Unionist communities breaking down. In the case of the Republican community, this was due to the inexcusable actions of the British Army, highlighted by the massacre of 26 unarmed civilians on Bloody Sunday. In the case of the Unionist community, this was due to the Heath government negotiating the Sunningdale Agreement, which would have set up a Northern Irish Assembly governed by a power-sharing executive, very similar to the terms that would eventually be agreed as part of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. As it was, however, the Ulster Unionists pulled out of the agreement and ended their cooperation with the Conservative Party. Heath's period in office would be dominated by disputes with trade unions, who were, at the time, close to the height of their power. Harold Wilson had backed away from a direct confrontation with the unions by shelving Barbara Castle's proposal in place of strife, and Thatcher was far more cautious in her dealings with the unions than many remember, opting instead for piecemeal reform and biding her time for a direct confrontation for when the circumstances would favour the government. But Heath was less cautious. His government passed the Industrial Relations Act 1971, which banned wildcat strikes and set up a special court to arbitrate disputes. In response to this, the Trades Union Congress voted to ignore the legislation, and trade unions took to the streets in protest. a campaign that was galvanised by the arrest and imprisonment of the Pentonville Five for refusing to appear before the National Industrial Relations Court. In the end, the act would be repealed by Wilson's Labour government. The confrontation with the unions really came to a head as a result of the Heath government's introduction of a statutory framework to govern wage rises. This attempted to cap wage rises above a certain level, in an attempt to control inflation, which was a recipe really for confrontation. As inflation increased, miners' wages fell in real terms, and as a result, an overtime ban was implemented with the aim of halving production of coal. This forced the government to implement a 3-day week, which limited the commercial use of electricity to 3 consecutive days, moved football matches to eliminate the use of floodlights, and switched off television broadcasts at 10:30 p.m, amongst other things. In the midst of this industrial unrest, Heath decided to call an election, asking the electorate the question, who governs Britain? Early elections in the UK have rarely proven to be a good idea, but it's quite astonishing in hindsight that Heath chose to call an election 16 months earlier than he needed to, with his party behind in the polls and facing such difficult domestic circumstances. And yet the election result was fairly indecisive in the circumstances, bringing Harold Wilson to power, leading a minority government. Prime Ministers are often remembered more for their failures than for their successes, but I think in the case of Heath he gets away with far too much, because in the public imagination of the 1970s, it's remembered as one big blob of inflation, unemployment and industrial unrest, which Labour ends up getting punished for, as Thatcher is swept to power, sweeping away the Labour Party and along with it the moderate One Nation tradition of conservatism represented by figures such as Heath. In some senses, the circumstances a Prime Minister confronts can't be helped, but Heath was dealt a poor hand and he played it badly. He was a shy, aloof man who could often come across as rude and dismissive, and he wasn't a great communicator, especially when contrasted with the witty and characterful Wilson. And yet, like many figures from this era, he was a political titan compared to many of the figures who rise to the top of our system in contemporary politics. Think of Liz Truss, for example. Heath was an intelligent man who took politics seriously and who loathed the woman who would go on to replace him as Conservative leader and Prime Minister for destroying the One Nation political tradition he was the last clear example of. In the end, Heath must rank towards the bottom of any list of post-war Prime Ministers, as he has few lasting achievements, lacked the qualities needed for the office of Prime Minister, and he was too bold in his confrontation with the unions, which ultimately brought his government down. Too harsh? What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and please don't forget to like and subscribe, and for now, goodbye and best wishes.